Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everybody. That's my David Frost impression there for the older ones amongst you. Welcome to another Paraplanners Assembly online event on this lockdown part 2 eve. So hope you've got everything ready for the next month. If you're new to these events, welcome. It's good to have you along. If you are not following us on Crowdcast yet, there's a button kind of up there. If you click that to follow us, it'll be very good news for us, because then we can send you updates about what's going on, and you'll get notification when we're about to go live and all sorts of other good things around that one. These are very relaxed, informal and interactive sessions. So on the right hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a chat window. Down the bottom of that, you can post a question, a comment, you can answer questions, have a chat amongst yourselves. Whatever you want to do is absolutely fine. Down the bottom of the screen, you'll see it says ask a question. You can pop questions in there as well if you want to. The nice thing about putting them there is that when we answer them, it puts a little flag in the video. So if you watch it back, you can jump straight to your question and it's much easier to find it one. Either way, I'll monitor all the questions and I'll fire those in as we go throughout the session. So this is your chance to really join in and ask any questions you've got around investment bonds and tax and offshore and all those kind of things. So this is the third and final installment in our series with Upmost, focusing on offshore investment bonds and tax and everything to do with those. Beforehand, we've looked at tax basics. And last time we did a deep dive into bond taxation and chargeable gains and top slicing and all those kind of good things. So if you haven't seen those before, I'll ask Max to pop a link in the chat room. You can go back and watch them again, see the videos, get the slides as well. Definitely worth it if you're into this particular area, or you want a refresher, or if you do some studying as well, really useful for you. This time we're going to look at how bonds can be used throughout life and beyond. We're not going to have a seance, but we're going to talk about what you can do with a bond, when somebody dies. It does happen. So we're going to focus on tax at death and succession planning and how trusts can be used. And I'm really pleased to welcome back Steve from Upmost, who's a long-standing friend of the Assembly, who's going to introduce himself, tell you a bit more about Upmost, and then we'll crack on.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'm Steve Sayre. For those who don't know me, basically I'm a technical sales manager at Upmost Wealth. Upmost Wealth, based in the Isle of Man and Ireland, offering offshore bonds. Well, more or less most jurisdictions in the world, a lot of the jurisdictions in the world these days, ranging from the UK, which is where I'm based, right across a lot of the countries in Europe, through to the Middle East, Dubai, and into the Far East, into Singapore. So, yeah, as Richard said, this is the third session, the third installment. And as Richard also said, we looked basically at the first week at some of the basics of offshore bonds. We looked at what the bond is. We looked at how it was notionally linked to underlying investments rather than holding investments themselves. And that was to give distinct tax advantages of the product. We looked at the ongoing tax position of the product, i.e. offering gross roll-up, the ability to change underlying linked investments, looked at the 5% and the chargeable event calculations. And then the week after, we looked at top slicing relief, went through the series of steps that you've got to go through to end up with the right result. There's no easy, quick solution anymore, unfortunately. But if you do follow those 6 steps, we showed how you could arrive at the result, and it's not too difficult calculation. Just bear those in mind, use those 6 steps as a template and be absolutely fine. And today we're going to finish off, if you like, with looking, as Richard said, at the tax position of the bond post-death. And I'm not referring to inheritance tax here. I'm looking at the chargeable events post-death and how they can vary and who's taxable. And then we'll look at this concept of succession planning using investment bonds, and basically introducing, if I'm going to the next slide, please, Richard, the bond for life scenario, looking at the individual investing in a bond initially, perhaps to accumulate wealth because he or she is attracted to the opportunities of gross return, of being in control of when they want a chargeable event to occur, maybe to utilize 5% tax deferred withdrawal facility as well. And then at some stage later, once they've accumulated some wealth, maybe other parts of financial planning becomes more important, maybe inheritance tax. And then we'll be looking at the opportunities of maybe turning that policy into an inheritance tax mitigation tool. We'll go through one or two examples, and at the end, there's also a link to a video with Richard, which Richard will give you. So, right, if we can go on to that next slide then.
I'll just jump in a second just to answer a couple of people in the chat room about the CPD. So Max is going to post the links. Oh, she's posted a message now. We'll post the links to the last two events, which it will give you access to the CPD certificate and the slides. And as Steve just said, I'll post a link at the end of this session, which will take you through to a special page for the slides and the CPD and this video, which is well worth watching about the life stage of a bond, both before and after death. So back to Steve.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Richard. So, as I say, we'll go through this bond for life concept, or life for bond, whichever way you want to look at it, and we'll come to one or two ideas of how the policy can be used for both this generation and the next generation. And I've got to say at outset, there's no idea is the correct one. It depends very much upon what the individual himself or herself wants to achieve. It depends on what their risk-reward ratio is. It depends on what else they want to achieve in terms of succession planning. So loads of different ideas. But what we can say is the investment bond can fit nicely in the center of that type of planning, being used in lots of different scenarios. So first, the technical bit, and what we wanted to do here is just consider the deceased estate and what happens on chargeable events if the deceased has owned a policy, whether that be a capital redemption bond or a life assurance bond. And really, I think to start off with this, we need to just sort of recap on who deals with the deceased estate. It is, of course, the personal representatives. In England and Wales, they are known as the executors if there's a valid will. If there is no valid will, they're referred to the administrators. Scotland makes it a little bit simpler. They refer to the personal reps always as the executors, but as the executor nominate if there is a will present, or as an executor dative if there is no will, i.e. the client died intestate.
Quick question for you, Steve, if I can. On the England and Wales law, if there isn't a valid will, which would then appoint personal representatives, who actually takes on the role of administrator?
I'm going to come back on that one, to be fair. Yes, can I come back to that one?
Yeah, I think it would be on the intestacy rules, wouldn't it, personally? But
I think it would be myself, but yeah, sorry.
Good question. Sorry,
right. So let's go on to the responsibilities of personal reps and the executors. So what have they got to do? Well, when the deceased died, it is the personal rep's responsibilities to look at the value of the estate. And to look at the value of estate means to look at the records, to effectively find out the individual's assets and liabilities, to gather those assets in, if you like, and then to apply for a grant of representation, a grant of probate, if you like, where there is a will, to set out what the estate was, to set out what the debt was, and then from that grant of probate, once any inheritance tax has been paid, then to distribute those assets to the, I'm going to use the term beneficiaries of the will of the deceased estate, but it could be legatees, it could be a number of different terms, but whoever is going to benefit from that estate. And of course, if we go on to the next slide, Richard, then that involves quite a lot of work. And it involves gathering in assets that may take some time for the legal ownership to be transferred from the deceased to the personal reps. And of course, during that time, lots of things can happen. And basically, any income that arises in that time or any gain that arises in that time, the personal reps will have a liability of settling the taxes on that income due. So if we go to the next slide, please, Richard. So the personal reps have a liability. The personal reps will have a liability at 20%. And then they make a distribution of that income to the beneficiaries once they've paid that tax. Now, what happens if an estate or deceased had held an investment bond? What happens if it held either a life insurance bond or perhaps even a capital redemption bond. And basically, there could be a difference on who the liability to the chargeable event is levied upon. It would be levied upon the individual who has died if he owned the policy at the date of death and he or she was the last life assured. Because on their death would trigger the chargeable event, which means that, on their death it triggers the chargeable event, and therefore the chargeable event is assessed upon the owner. Now, that's the individual who owned the policy or is taxed on two different occasions. One, if he owned the policy direct and the life assured trigger the chargeable event, but also, funnily enough, if he was the settlor of a non-charitable trust. And again, the death caused the trustee, so the life policy, to pay out. The chargeable event would also rest upon the settlor. Now, there is a major difference here, because if the individual owned a policy himself, then the life assurance, as we said, causes the policy to pay out. The chargeable event would be assessed upon the deceased. If the policy was written on either multiple lives assurance basis or was written as a capital redemption bond, which you may recall has no lives assured, then quite clearly the policy owner's death would not trigger a chargeable event. And what that means is that should the policy itself pass into the ownership of the personal reps by reason of death, and the personal reps then encash the policy, surrender the policy, the chargeable event would be assessed on them. And that is important because it means that you have to look at the tax position of the personal reps. And the personal reps don't have any personal allowances or savings allowances. They can't benefit from top slicing relief. They'll pay tax at 20%. Now, one interesting point is that's the position if the policy is in an individual's ownership, and the personal reps encash it after he dies. And it could be in the same financial year that he dies. It doesn't make any difference. The personal reps would be liable. The major difference is that if we're looking at trustees, because if trustees own a policy and they encash it in the year after, and they cash it in the year of the settlor's death, then the settlor is still liable. And that, because the settlor is still liable, it means that any gain can be offset against his or her personal allowances. And top slicing relief could be available. And because the gain is being paid for, if you like, by the settlor, it reduces the value of his estate for IHT purposes. So lots of advantages and lots of I suppose, differences that we need to be aware of, depending on what type of policy we're looking at. Is it life assurance? Is it single life assured? Is it multiple lives assured? Who encashes the policy? Is it the personal reps, or is the policy held on trust? Major differences.
A couple of questions, Steve, that I thought might come in when you started talking about this. I'll save the second one for the next slide because I think it might answer it. But the first one is a situation where if bonds in trust and the trustees surrender the bond in the year after one of the settlors has died. It's a joint settlor case. So one settlor has died, one settlor is still alive, and it's surrendered in the year after one of the settlors has died.
Yeah.
Is the tax liability split 50% to the living settlor and 50% on the trustees?
It is. And to be fair, I mean, I was going to bring that up on the slide after next, but that's fine, Richard. I mean, it is a very valid question, and it's something I think is very much overlooked. And I tell you why it was important to me is we get a lot of questions on loan trusts, and we do not market a joint settlor loan trust. Some companies do. And one of the reasons we don't is because of that. Because if you think, you say maybe a husband and wife who set up a joint settlor loan trust, invariably one of them dies well, one will die first, and invariably it will be in different tax years. So on the first death, maybe the loan will pass to the surviving settlor. And then some years later, the remaining settlor will die. Now, if there's still a loan outstanding, the trustees presumably will have to encash the policy to repay the loan to the personal reps. And if they do that, then, as you're hinting at there, then you're going to have a chargeable event. And the chargeable event will be 50% upon the settlor, the last settlor to die, because it's been encashed in the year of death of his or her, which means that great for that proportion of the chargeable events, in that you've got the settlor's taxes, the settlor's personal allowances to use, and of course top slicing relief. But on the other 50%, well, from the other settlor that died some years ago, then unfortunately that's going to be taxed at the trustees' rate of 45%, and you will have no personal allowances other than above the standard rate band for trustees, etc., which we know can be as low as £200.
So timing's very, very important, but it's really hard to predict when people are going to die, isn't it? That's the
tricky
thing.
It is. But what you want, of course, is that flexibility. And then just to say, go on to that, if the personal reps surrender the policy, then they pay tax at 20%. And unlike an individual, they have no allowances that they can offset against any of that gain. And once they've paid the tax, if they distribute the proceeds, or when they distribute the proceeds to the beneficiaries of the estate, it's a bit like trustees issuing income from a discretionary trust. They have to issue an R185 like the trustees do to show the actual tax deducted. But the interesting point is, as far as the beneficiary is concerned, it's taxed as non-savings income. And so it doesn't really matter, if they've got personal savings allowance, if they've got the starting rate band for savings, it makes no difference. The gain or the income they receive from the personal reps cannot be offset against that. So, it's important, I think, to stop that happening if possible.
The second question I had, which was around this particular thing, was about the flow of the cash, if you like. Let's follow the money. So if you're a personal representative and there's tax to pay, does that cash come out of your own money, or does it come out of the estate's money? How does the money move around? Who actually pays it?
Well, it'll be coming from the estate's money, but it's the estates that you are the assets that you're gathering in, and so it reduces the amount of money that's available for distribution as and when the final accounts are submitted and everything's finally wound up.
Yeah, it's not a personal tax charge. It's you're acting on behalf.
No, nobody would be a personal rep or an executor on that basis.
Exactly. Never be a trustee.
So. Exactly. So go on to the next slide then, please, Richard. And basically, all the next slide is looking to show is the personal reps do have a problem with income that they receive, and it doesn't really matter where that income is from, whether it's bank, building society interest, if there is such a thing these days. There are dividends from shares, where it's rental from property. The personal reps will pay tax at 20%, and which they have no allowances that they can offset against that. And so, where we're coming with this is the ability of bonds in general to add value. And basically, what a bond can do, it can continue after death if it's on a multiple lives assured basis or on a capital redemption basis. And what that will do, of course, it means that the trustees, the personal reps themselves, don't have to surrender the policy. Now, I say they don't have to, because inevitably what happens with a lot of personal reps, and these can be solicitors' practices, lots of different occasions, where the client, the policyholder, dies, and one of the things they want to do is they want to gather the assets in. It's their duty after all. But they think part and parcel of that gathering the assets in is to surrender the policy. And if it's on a multiple life basis or a capital redemption bond basis, they don't have to do it. And we've already seen, if they surrender the policy, you've got liability on the personal reps, etc. It's perhaps not the best thing to do.
I think that's a good point there, because if you're a power planner or an advisor and you've been through the probate and administration process, maybe on a personal level, then for all but the simplest of estates, then you'll know it can be a really tricky process to get through. You may have come across it in your professional life, maybe helping a client. It's a great way that you can help a client that's either personal rep, an administrator, whatever involvement they've got. There's lots of little trapdoors along the way that people can fall into, like this one, such as gathering in an asset, so just surrendering a bond when there are other options. So it's a great way that we can help the end clients actually navigate through these kind of processes.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think, one of the things that you have to do or need to do is, when you get a request from a personal rep, whether it's a professional acting in that capacity or a lay personal rep, is to maybe just ask that question: is this the right thing to do? And maybe point them in other directions, because inevitably there could be a tax saving just purely by deferring. And then, of course, the bonds are held in trust. We've already referred to this question as to who's liable on any gain if there is a chargeable event on death. And basically, it really does depend if gain is triggered in the year of the settlor's death, then it's the settlor who is liable. And that's good news from a tax basis, because it means that it's his tax rates that are brought into the equation in calculating the tax liability on the chargeable event, and his allowances, if he's got them, can be used to offset against any of those chargeable event gains. But if the policy is in trust and the trustees wait until that following tax year and then encash the policy, well, it's the trustees that are liable. And of course, what that means with an offshore bond, they're going to be paying tax at 45%, no topside relief. And of course, just that, well, they've got that standard rate band. It's going to be available to give a tax liability of 20%, but it's absolute maximum with £1,000 and more likely to be less than that, and certainly would be if the settlor had made multiple settlements. So the question is, on the next slide, I suppose, is there a way of avoiding the trustee rate? And of course, the answer is there is. And that's using the fact that the policy can be assigned. And of course, if you have a policy that's got multiple lives assured, if you have a policy, it's a capital redemption bond, we know that the settlor's death or the individual's death will not give rise to a chargeable event, which is great news. It also means that it gives the owners, whether it's the personal reps or the trustees, control over what they do with the policy. And basically what they don't want to be doing is the personal reps then cashing in the year of death, or the trustees then cashing in the year following the year of death. And instead, what they can do is simply assign the policy directly to the beneficiaries of the estate or of the trust, and in which case any future chargeable event will fall upon them.
Couple of questions before we move on to the next bit.
Yep.
First one is, if the situation arises where the tax is paid by the dead settlor, in this case, does that tax charge reduce their estate for IHT purposes?
Yes, it will do.
Okay, good. That comes under there's no such thing as a too simple question, because that's a really good question. And the second one is in the same field, really. Can a bond be assigned to anyone?
Well, the answer is yeah. I mean, a bond can be assigned to anybody over the age of majority, which is obviously 18 in England and Wales, 16 in Scotland, i.e. as long as they've got the power to contract, it can be assigned. And basically, it can even be assigned for the benefit of minors. And normally the way we would do that is to assign the policy to a bear trust, where they are the beneficiaries thereof. And again, the other thing I should mention, of course, if we're looking at trustees and assigning, then they should be in the powers and given to them by means of that trustee, that they will be assigning to classes of beneficiaries that they're allowed to do so.
I'm glad you brought up the last one about signing for the benefit of minors, because that's one that's often overlooked. And it's a niche one, but it's one that can come in quite handy sometimes. Yeah,
no, absolutely true. Because again, you're using their allowances, which is a great thing. The other thing with minors, of course, is we'll touch on this, we'll go through, is the parental settlement rules as well come into play. So parents to minor children can be problematic. Grandparents to grandchildren is not. That's a great way of planning. So, bearing that in mind, we now turn to looking at this concept of a bond for life. and how it can be utilized at different stages of the individual's life for different types of planning. And I've got to say, this is, of course, this is assuming an Utmost bond has been invested in by the client, simply because one of the features of the Utmost capital redemption bond is that it can be converted at some future date from a normal standalone investment bond, if you like, into a discounted gift scheme, effectively. So it would be converted and then transferred into trust, and it becomes a discounted gift trust. So one of the ways you can look at this is an investment bond with Utmost is a deferred discounted gift trust. And I think it effectively, can you look at even better than that, it's just a deferred trust. So it can be assigned to trust, but one of the things is a discounted gift trust. So here we're looking at an individual case. And for anybody who's been to any of the Utmost technical academies recently, and I say recently when we used to do them live, i.e. about a year ago, we introduced this concept, these particular clients to the audience of Brian and Kate. And we went through a particular lifestyle of Brian, looking at different aspects of his planning in terms of inheritance tax planning, in terms of residence nil rate band, and then going on to looking at child event legislation and so on, but bringing it back to a case study. And because we were looking at this individual, we called him Brian, and we entitled the presentation The Life of Brian. And what we want to do here is bring back Brian, if you like, and his wife, Kate. They're now, if you like, 64 and 61-year-old attained, and they've got this money, 2.2 million, that they want to invest. Now, straight away, I want to stress that this is not all their assets. They have assets that will qualify for business relief. They've got a number of investments. This, if you like, is just surplus cash that they want to invest maybe for long-term planning and succession planning. And we're not going to go into the inheritance tax liability on the estate and what happens with everything else that they do. We're just concentrating on this £2.2 million of investments. And if we go to the next slide, please, Richard. Now, straight away, what Brian and Kate decide to do is they decide to split the investments, because they decide to split the investments into two policies, one of 1 million, and as we'll see in a couple of minutes, one for 1.2 million. Now, why do they want to do that? Well, they have been made aware by their advisor of the different facilities and different opportunities that are available under different products. And again, cast our minds back to week one, where we were looking at what assets a policy can be linked to. Well, Brian's advisor has been through that with him. And what happens is Brian's actually therefore decided to invest £1 million into policy one, which is an Irish policy, an Utmost Ireland policy. Now, the reason he's done it that way is he's happy for Utmost to appoint an external manager to manage the underlying linked assets to the policy. He's happy for those assets to be individual stocks and shares, because he's happy with the concept that he's not paying fund fees on that basis, so it's a cheaper investment and the returns are potentially higher. But he's also attracted that Ireland has this VAT advantage in that there's no VAT payable on the external manager's fund management charges. And he thinks that could give a considerable advantage over the years. So 1 million, he decides to invest on his and his wife's behalf into the Irish product. And from that, he takes a withdrawal of £24,000 per annum. And what he's doing with that, he's taking withdrawal himself. Whether that's the best advice or not, I'm not making comment, but he's taken the withdrawal himself. It's within the 5%. And he's using that to help, if you like, subsidize, I suppose, his grandchildren's school fees for the next 3 years. Again, in reality, he might have been better assigning segments to them and cashing it in their name. It'd be probably better from a tax position. But, you know, ours is not to wonder why, what's actually happened. Now, the other 1.2 million, he decides to invest in an investment bond in the Isle of Man, a capital redemption bond. And with this, he decides to manage the underlying investments himself. His investments, if you like, are restricted to those that are stipulated in Section 520 of the Income Tax Trade and Other Income Act, i.e. they're collectives, for want of a better term, which means they're not highly personalised, and there's going to be no draconian ongoing tax charge of the bond because it's not going to be a highly personalised bond. And so we have these two policies, and what we want to do now is to concentrate on that bottom policy and what Brian and Kate's options are going forward. And so let's take it forward. Well, let's take it forward a year, as it were. And Brian's had this policy invested. It's now grown to 1.24 million. It was invested in, well, £500 per segment, so 2,400 segments. And hey, it was a great opportunity come up because Brian and Kate have been looking at buying a holiday home in the Lake District. And there's one come up, and Brian would like to be able to access monies to buy that property. The problem is that his other assets that he owns are illiquid. And indeed, even the cash accounts he has, well, he took advisor advice and went on to 6 monthly deposits, as it were. So there was time deposits where there's going to be a penalty that should he withdraw the money. And so what he does is he uses his policy, he uses as security for a loan, and it's great with Utmost because Utmost has this A+ Fitch rating, so readily acceptable as far as the banks are concerned as security, and actually borrows £500,000 from his bank in order to fund that holiday home. And when his time deposits are elapsed, if you like, are available, then he simply uses that to pay that loan back to his bank.
Just to be clear on that, because I'm old enough to remember the concept of policy loans many years ago, where you could actually borrow from your bond. That's not what we're talking about here, is it? It's about taking a loan from a bank or somewhere and using it as security.
Correct, exactly that. I mean, yeah, if you took a loan from the policy itself, unfortunately, that would be a chargeable offence. Yeah. But it's just using that policy as security for another loan to, well, help with the short-term cash flow in this particular instance, to give him an opportunity of investing in an asset that otherwise he may lose. So that's what he does. But the beauty of this is, by doing that, there is no tax charge. There is no chargeable event. The policy can be readily assigned as security for a loan. That doesn't give rise to a chargeable event. And once that loan's repaid off, back to Brian, again, no chargeable event. So the flexibility is starting to build up, if you like. So we're going to the next slide then, Richard. And if we roll the clock forward, I suppose, 2 years, Brian and Kate are obviously a little bit older. Brian's now 67, Kate's 64. And that 2,400 segmented policy that they invested in is now worth 1.3 million. And their advisor is saying, well, you know, Brian, Kate, it's about time you actually start looking at your inheritance tax situation, your succession planning. You know, what you're going to do if something happens. And a number of options are being considered. And one of the things that they actually decide to do is to convert some of their policy, their segments in that policy, into a discounted gift trust. And they decide to convert 1,800 segments of their 2,400 segments into a discounted gift trust. It's written on an absolute trust basis. And as you can see from the figures there, the discounts available with Brian to get a discount of 255,000, and Kate 273,000, so total discount of 529,000. The gift element in total 445, meaning that immediately they should save an inheritance tax saving of £211,000. I've got to say that is on the assumption that they take 4% withdrawals, and the 4% withdrawals is calculated with respect to the original premium. So 1,800 segments at £500 per segment, so that would be £36,000 per annum. They're quite happy that this is written on an absolute trust basis because they have 2 children, Simon and Sophie. They're happy that they can't change the beneficiaries. They're happy in the knowledge that they've carved out this income for the rest of their lives, and that Simon and Sophie cannot access the policy until something happens to both of them. And they're happy that the flexibility that it's given them. Now, if we go on to the next slide then, Richard, so we've converted 1,800 segments into a discounted gift trust. That leaves us 600 segments of that remaining policy. What do they do with that? Well, they've got the choice. They still own those segments, so they could still have it invested for their own benefit. They could take withdrawals from those segments. And again, we're now into year 3, so they can take, well, 5% per annum for 3 years. So again, 15% if they wanted, tax-deferred basis. Or what they could do, because coincidentally, I should say, and on the next slide, please, Richard, the value of those segments is, sorry, next slide. Yeah, sorry, yeah, is 325,000. What they could have done is maybe use that as the gift being within the no rate band, making maybe an assignment onto a discretionary trust, or making a direct assignment to their grandchildren. Now, let's roll the clock forward another 7 years. So now we're in year 10. And this is presentation world, so we can make some assumptions to fit the story. And the assumptions that we're making is 7 years after the investment into the DGT, 7 full years, Brian and Kate both die. Which means that as we're talking about an absolute trust, the pets have expired effectively. There's been no liability. Everything is outside the estate. And of course, basically, we now have these 1,800 segments that were in the discounted gift trust, effectively now being held just on bare trust and being held for the benefit of their son, Simon, and their daughter, Sophie.
He's got very large of the sun on that slide. I don't know what happened there.
Well, yeah, I think what should happen with that is that it's Sophie that we want to concentrate on now and see what happens to her share of the segments and what she could do with them. So we've got 1,800 segments in total. That means that 900 is effectively Sophie's as of right. 900 is Simon's. And basically what we'll do, or what the trustees will do, is assign the 900 segments to Sophie, which is worth basically 525,000 at that point. Now, Sophie, what does she do with that money? Well, again, she has options. She is now simply the owner of an investment bond, and she can do with it what she wants. Now, the thing about Sophie, of course, is that she's quite successful. She's very successful in her own career. She actually turns out that she's a lawyer, and she has no need of any of the monies in the policy, certainly not at that time. And so she leaves the investment intact, and she continues to benefit, or the policy continues to benefit from the gross roll-up, the ability of changing the investment manager, changing the investment strategy of the underlying portfolio to maximize returns, even appointing the investment manager, an external investment manager, if necessary. Lots of things can be done. And so it is that the policy stays intact in Sophie's name for a further 7 years, by which time her 3 children are now at university, and Sophie is thinking of the best way of taking monies out of the policy in terms of tax efficiency. Remember, she has 900 segments. Those segments are now worth £750,000, £750,000. She has 3 children, and what she decides to do is to assign segments equally to those children. So let's look at the individual position of child A, which we'll call Emily. Emily receives 300 segments, now worth £250,000. And basically, thank you, Richard, moving on. We'll look at Emily, once she's received those segments, surrendering them and see what the tax liability would be. We know they're worth £250,000. We know, going right back to the start, where Brian and Kate had invested in the policy, well, it wasn't the start, it was year T plus 3 years later, where they exercised that conversion option and converted the policy or part of the policy to a discounted gift trust. And at which point they started to take withdrawals from the policy of £36,000 a year. Well, of course, if we're calculating a chargeable event for Emily, we've got to take into account those previous withdrawals. And so on 300 segments, the previous withdrawals are 300 divided by 1,800 times the withdrawals it took, £6,000 per annum. And so when we start looking at the calculation, then we've got to add 7 years worth of those 6,000 withdrawals into the equation, so £42,000. Put those figures into the charge event calculation, and hey presto, we come up with this figure of 142,000 being the amount of the chargeable event. Now, that is the good thing, because we can then, with that gain, we can start looking at what the tax liability is. And remember, Emily is at university. She does not have any earned income of her own. She's got, therefore, her personal allowance, she's got a starting rate band for savings, and she's got a personal savings allowance. And we can take those into account, if applicable, as far as the calculation for the chargeable event, to calculate the tax on the gain from that chargeable event in terms of top slicing relief. And so let's do that. So we've got £142,000 of gain. Step one, if you can remember from 2 weeks ago, we look at the allowances available. Well, 142,000 gain, even with no other income, means that Emily doesn't have a personal allowance. And so we've worked through it. She's got the starting rate band for savings. She's got the personal savings allowance. So some income is taxable at 20%, 32,000, and the rest of the gain is taxable at 40%. So we know the total tax liability from the chargeable event for Emily is 48,200. We then take off that the basic rate tax liability on the policy from the top slicing relief calculation, so 19,800. Then we work out the tax on the slice. Well, the slice is simply the chargeable gain divided by the number of years, 17 in this example, so 8,300. Work out the top slicing relief, 19,800, and the actual tax due would be 28,400. So the net proceeds, as far as Emily is concerned, is £221,000, i.e. she has paid tax on that of just less than 20%, which is really good as far as she's concerned.
Quick question for you, Steve, on that one.
Yeah.
Can they use the full 17 years for the top slicing calculation for when the bond started?
They can, yeah, because it doesn't depend. It depends on when the bond starts, and it depends upon the number of whole years the policy has been in force effectively. So yes, they can, right back to the start. And this is one of the big advantages of the bond. It can it can change ownership from an individual to a trust back to an individual, and that final individual can top slice right back to the start, which is what Emily's done here. Right, so go on to the next slide then, Richard. Now, basically, we then start looking at alternatives. I mean, one of the things that Brian and Kate might have decided to do at the outset is, instead of investing or converting their joint policy into a joint settlor discounted gift trust, they may have decided to assign segments to each other, not of taking the 1,800, so that's 900 segments to each, and then for themselves to actually set out an individual settlor discounted gift trust. And we can see the figures on there showing the amount of discounts that is available, taking exactly the same income as before, that 4%. So if we go on to the next slide, Richard, you'll see a summary of what they've achieved. If they were to do two single settlor discounted gift trusts, then you can see the total discount outside the estate is 455,000, and that is less than, of course, a joint settlor. And the reason being is, with a joint settlor discounted gift trust, you're carving out the right to income for the remainder of both your lives until the last life fails. With a single settlor, of course, is half that income will stop on the first life failing. Now, that's a big, I suppose, negative. You get less of a discount. But the big positive with single settle or discounted gift trusts is the fact that on the first death, then the individual themselves, if it's been set up not on a bare trust, on a discretionary trust basis, then you are left with a discretionary trust. That DGT becomes a discretionary trust. And you can have widows and widowers as potential beneficiaries of that discretionary trust. Which means that, if we go into the next slide, please, Richard.
I've just got a quick question before we do, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's to do with joint settlor trust. And I think you've pretty much answered it already, but it's quite a long one, so I'll paraphrase it here. With a joint settlor, a discounted gift trust, when the first settlor dies, does their income stop? And does that release the fund in respect of their benefit for the beneficiaries?
On a joint settlor trust?
Yeah.
No, on the joint settlor trust, the income, the fund will continue until the failure of the second settlor, because the income is carved out for both their benefits. On a single settlor trust, then that's exactly what happens. Two single settlor trusts, and that can be more flexible, but at the price, of course, is less of a discount.
Is that applicable to all joint settlor trusts, or is that just an utmost specific thing?
No, I think it's applicable to all because as far as I know, on DGTs, you are carving out the right to income on a second life basis. I mean, there may be some out there, I suppose, that could that might just carve it out on the first life basis, but I don't know of any, Richard. I've got to say.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So the argument for single settlor, well, effectively, it gives more flexibility once that first settlor dies, because then you are left with a discretionary trust. And of course, what that means is the trustees may be able to appoint income to the surviving settlor, or indeed capital. But say the cost of that is that the discount will inevitably be lower. So going on to the next slide then, please, Richard. So what else, what are the scenarios? Well, we looked going back to year T+3, when Brian and Kate started out their DGT planning, their inheritance tax planning. They had another 600 segments that they decided to keep. And one of the things they could have done that with that, because it coincidentally was worth 325,000, i.e. the amount of the nil rate band at the time, they could have invested that into a discretionary trust for their grandchildren as beneficiaries. And of course, living further 7 years after that, then that they fall outside of the calculation as far as the IHT and the available nil rate band, as nil rate band would be available again. Now, just on that, settling nil rate bands onto discretionary trust, people think, well, okay, how valuable is that in reality? You know, it's only 325,000. My client is very, very wealthy. It's really not going to solve an awful lot of problems in terms of the IHT planning. But if we go to the next slide, we can see how utilizing the nil rate band over a series of 7-year periods can add up to a considerable benefit. And here we have Brian, and let's say he's utilized that nil rate band himself, settling 325,000 of those segments, all invested in that bond, onto a discretionary trust. And what we can see, that 325,000, 7-year periods later, i.e. when Brian is now 88, would now be worth at a 5% growth rate, 905,000. Now, 7 years later, if Brian's got the assets, he could do exactly the same again. This time, of course, he can again settle the available nil rate band. We assume that it's gone up, it's increased in line with CPI, and it's now worth 386,000. And of course, that can be invested in this discretionary trust, and it will grow at 5%. And we can do the same 7 years later. And the net result of that is, should Brian do that, just settling his available nil rate band every 7 years, achieving only 5% growth, then the effect of that is actually achieving a discretionary trust that's outside of his estate that will be valued at over £2.3 million. And of course, it's not just Brian who can do that, but Kate, his wife, could do it as well. And on this simple planning technique, you're ending up with assets outside the estate, 4.6 million. And it's coming from this investment bond that they actually owned themselves at outset. Now, that's one thing they could do. What else could they do? Well, subject to them having assets available, they may decide to establish a loan trust. Now, this would be coming from other assets as opposed to the bond itself initially. But the beauty of loan trusts, as we all know, if we go on to the next slide, is a loan trust basically solves that what if type objection. What if I need access to the monies? What if this happens? And of course, the beauty of the loan trust means that the trustees can repay the outstanding loan at any time. Now, invariably, what the trustees do is they invest the money, typically in an investment bond, because they want to achieve gross roll-up without any ongoing tax liabilities as far as the trust is concerned. And then they make use of the 5%. And if the settlor wants a repayment of the loan at 5%, they can take 5% withdrawal from the bond, use that to repay the loan. It's repayment of capital, no chargeable event.
This is nice kind of slow burn IHT planning, isn't it?
It is, and you've got to start, relatively young to make some benefit of it. But nevertheless, for that client who asks that what if scenario, then it becomes a very effective type of planning tool. And again, that's all that slide is showing is what the periodic charge would be, and it's assessed upon the effective net value of the loan trust, i.e. after the loan is deducted. And so it's some considerable time before even a periodic charge would start to be levied upon the trust. But if we go on to the next slide, see, one of the problems with a loan trust is that loan is in the estate, and it's been set up to answer that type of what if scenario. And a lot of clients actually find that they don't need access to the loan. It's there as a comfort factor, but in reality, you've got enough assets elsewhere, you just don't need it. And so what they can start doing is they can start writing off that loan. They could use their 3,000 annual exemption, for instance, or 6,000 they haven't used last year's. But it's making a small contribution, but it is a small contribution at the end of the day. What else could they do? Well, they could go to the next slide, please, Richard. They could actually waive more of the loan. And it depends on what nil rate bands they've got available, because if they waive more of the loan onto to the trustees of a discretionary loan trust, then of course that would be a chargeable lifetime transfer. But if they haven't utilised the nil rate band, then perhaps it's a good way of utilising that nil rate band at the time. And in Brian's case, what he decides to do, he decides to waive £100,000 of his loan to the trust, and he, as a trustee, amongst with others, decides to invest that money. Next slide, please, Richard. For the benefit of his grandchildren and their school fees. And in this particular example, £100,000 is settled by the discretionary trust onto a bare trust for his grandchildren. It's going to achieve, say, 5% investment return, so worth £105,000 at the end of that year. They then take withdrawals across all the segments of £12,000 a year that pays the school fees. And of course, that's an excess withdrawal. But we're now looking at a bare trust. And on who does that excess withdrawal fall? The beneficiaries, who are the grandchildren, who've got their personal allowances, savings allowances, etc. And even though it's an excess, his net result is with the grandkids, it's not going to give rise to a tax liability. And so we can go all the way through that, and we can see, even though we've got excesses over a number of years from the withdrawals to pay the school fees, there is no actual tax liability as far as the grandchildren are concerned. Now, that's one scenario. We could go into another scenario with a bond. And this is going back to the nil rate band planning with the discretionary trust as before, exactly the same slide. But if the client has assets available, we can accelerate this. Because when you think about it, if he's got lots of assets available, what he can do is he can use this maybe in conjunction with a loan trust. And if we go into that next slide, Richard, we can see, as before, what Brian might do is to settle $325,000 onto discretionary trust this year. We know it's going to be worth $905,000 on that prescriptive 5% growth rate. But we also know that under the previous planning tool, what he was going to do was to settle a further nil rate band 7 years later and a further nil rate band 7 years after that. Now, what he could do is, if he's got the monies available, is to make those future nil rate band settlements, if you like, available as a loan to a loan trust. and in which case he would invest 845,000 as a loan to a loan trust. And then 7 years later, what he would do is write off the nil rate band, the 386,000. And then 7 years after that, you'd write off the remaining loan, which of course is the nil rate band 7 years later. And what has he achieved? Well, he's achieved having more money invested in a trust in a potential gross roll-up environment through an investment bond for a longer period of time. And now, of course, instead of having inheritance tax savings or value, of the loan trust of being 2.3 million as before, we now have the value of that discretionary trust being 905, exactly the same, plus the loan trust value is now an additional 2.3 million. So we're looking at 3.3 million outside the estate compared to 2.3 million just using a discretionary trust, just by purely bringing forward the date of investment and benefiting from that gross roll-up. And so with that in mind, there's lots of different scenarios we could look at. I started off by saying there is no one answer. If you go onto the links which Richard supplied and look at the video, you can see another scenario where we're looking at Mr. and Mrs. B, the clients, as it were, make the investments as before. So they've got 2.2 million. But this time, the video now looks at what happens with the son's side of the equation. And it considers different options. It considers changing investment managers, what the flexibility that a bond brings you. And yeah, I think that's probably about 1 o'clock, Richard.
That is impeccable timing, as always, Steve. I've come to expect it from you, so that was really good, Dick. And there's some really good ideas and strategies in there. And I've been through that a couple of times. I'll go back and watch it again because it's really good. And I've put a link in the chat room there, which takes you to a page on our website, which has got, as Steve said, it's got the slides, the CPD certificate, and the video, which kind of expands on this a bit more. And I know that Utmost are producing some more material to keep the story going on that one. Yeah. So definitely worth spending sort of 5-6 minutes having a look at that one. I've got a couple of questions that are left, if that's okay for you, Steve. The first one is, can both Isle of Man and Ireland-based bonds issued by Utmost be converted to a discounted gift trust?
As long as they are capital redemption bonds.
Okay.
If the life assurance policies, then if you have the settlor or settlor spouse's life assurance, it falls foul of the anti-avoidance legislation. So as long as they're capital redemption bonds at outset, then yes, they can be converted.
Okay, and the last one is from Jan, and that's, what suggestions are there to pay the 10-year IHT charges in a neat way for a trust that only has a bond? That's a good one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I suppose the neatest way is the trustees to take a withdrawal, and as long as that's with the 5%, there'll be no tax liability. Yeah. Or no tax liability at that point in time, I should say.
Yeah, I think that's the only one. A follow-on question from that: if a trust has a bond like that and there isn't a chargeable gain or chargeable event, I should say, do they have to still do a tax return?
No, not at all. If that is their only asset. Yeah, which again makes life simple, and particularly when you're talking and advising lay trustees.
Yeah, we like simplicity. That definitely works for us without a shadow of a doubt. Well, Steve, that was brilliant. Thank you for all the time and preparation you've put into this series of 3 events, and you imparted so much really good technical information, knowledge, and loads of really good planning strategies that lots of power planners can use with clients they're working for. So thank you so much for that. Thank you also to Utmost. Without your support, we couldn't do these kind of things. So on behalf of all the power planners in our community, a big thank you to everyone at Utmost there for supporting us again this year. If you want to keep the conversation going, don't forget you can go onto the Big Tent, and lots of questions and answers going on there. So keep it going there. Our next event is on the 18th of November. And we've got Les Cameron, fresh from the Tax and Trust Tea Room with the big day out, coming back to do some more stuff on tax, particularly around pensions and some clever tax planning around there. There's a link I've just put in the chat box there if you want to book onto that one. Don't forget, we're back at the end of each month as well. So I'm going to finish off by saying a big thank you once again to Steve for all the questions we've had in today. Stay safe, take care in lockdown version 2. We'll still be here online, and we'll see you all again very soon. But for now, it's goodbye from us. Goodbye.
Bye.